Should gender identity or struggles with gender issues be used as a defense? Should it get you less time in prison for a very heinous crime? Those are some of the pressing questions in the case of Sophie Roske. You may not know her name, but chances are you've heard of conservative Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. Roske pled guilty to the attempted assassination of Kavanaugh in June of 2022. The 29-year-old ultimately stood down on the attack, but officials say Roske got close. They say they found a cache of weapons on the suspect that included a pistol, a crowbar, ammunition, and zip ties. There's a mountain of evidence showing deliberate planning and premeditation. And now, prosecutors are asking for a minimum of 30 years as Roske's sentence. But here's the twist. Roske, who went by the name Nicholas John Roske at the time of the attempted plot, now identifies as a trans woman who goes by the name Sophie. And recent high-profile shootings have drawn a lot of attention to people with transgender ties. There's been a lot of talk on whether there is a link between mental illness and being transgender. But is that even true? And if so, is that the case here? I'm criminal trial attorney Sara Azari, and here on Serving Justice, we do not shy away from the tough topics. Joining me now is NewsNation reporter Safia Samee Ali and Dr. Lauren Kaplan, a forensic psychologist. And thank you, Dr. Kaplan, and good to see you, Safia. I want to start with Dr. Kaplan. There are a lot of questions about Roske's mental health, right? And just as a criminal defense attorney who practices in the federal arena, mental illness is a textbook mitigating circumstance, what we call 3553 factor arguments at sentencing. So there was a 911 transcript that makes it very clear that Roske's in distress. She's suicidal. She's planning to kill Kavanaugh and herself. And then her lawyers are raising mental illness as a mitigating circumstance for sentencing, and essentially claiming that, you know, she's had a lot of struggles with gender identity, that they sort of exacerbated some of her mental conditions. Is there room for the defense to use her gender identity as a mitigating factor to get a reduced sentence? And is there a DSM 5 or 4? Are we on 5 or 4 nowadays?
We're on 5, like TR. We're on 5 TR now.
Is there a DSM-5 TR diagnosis for this? And what is the nexus? I know it's a complicated question, but if you could break it down for us.
So yes, there is gender dysphoria. It was previously referred to as gender identity disorder, but it was changed in DSM-5, or maybe the DSM-4 TR, but ultimately it was changed to the dysphoria to represent that discomfort, rather than just having an identity disorder, which kind of reminds one of like a personality disorder.
Oh,
but
I
that discomfort of one's expressed gender with like the internalized gender that they believe themselves to be. And so
it is not a personality disorder, though, right?
No, it is not a personality disorder. It's just, I think that language didn't capture that dysphoric nature of it as well. And so that was their rationale for changing it to gender dysphoria. I mean, there's been a lot of changes to the language. In general, there used to be gender reassignment surgery, and now it's more like gender affirming surgery. So, but I think the dysphoric piece of that distress that is prevalent throughout, I mean, because there's the child onset and then adolescent onset. So it can appear at different points, but there's that piece of being uncomfortable and it causing a lot of distress to not be congruent in one's like expressed gender and like birth gender. In a sense.
You know, I can tell you that I've been an ally to this community. I've represented transgender women in civil rights cases. I have some friends who are advocates in the community. One of them is a pilot for Alaska Airlines, and this is there is a real struggle, that transgender people go through. They are essentially trapped in the wrong body. And when and if and how they come out and identify as the opposing gender is just something that is it's not an easy thing. There's a lot of suffering in that. And so I guess in this context, it's interesting to talk about this, because I mean, we're going to hear from Safia and all these crazy things that people have said before as a defense or as a mitigating circumstance. This is not all that crazy. There's real suffering here. And Dr. Kaplan, um, like I said, mental health is a legitimate mitigating factor. I have clients who I argue they have depression, anxiety, they have some sort of maybe even personality disorder, whatever it is, because as defense lawyers, our job is to go to any and all lawful lengths to get our client the most minimal time or no time, and
Sure.
save their liberty. So um, is it that it's the gender identification itself that is the mental illness, or this DSM-5 TR that you're talking about, or is
Yeah.
it because there are other conditions that sort of go along with it, or it exacerbates?
So that's a complicated question because unfortunately, I think our field, and I say our field, the psychological field, but also the medical field, because this came about. I mean, so if you trace back, it's been around a while, but
Yeah.
in terms of uh it was just a sudden kind of movement in a sense of gender dysphoria, and then uh, you know, attributing. I remember first seeing it 2013 during one of my practicum. It was a 6-year-old, and so that was like really because when I was in graduate school, it was talked about, but it wasn't as big of a focus as it is now.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that what has happened is that unfortunately, and not all clinicians, but there are many clinicians where, a lot of this stuff is self-report. And so people are going in and especially like children or people with comorbid disorders like autism
Mhm.
or something, and they're reporting symptoms, and the internet plays a role, and community plays a role, and childhood plays a role, and then they're just being put on hormones
Mm.
immediately without there being a thorough assessment, like a holistic assessment of all different like factors of like childhood, to make sure that there are not other, because with gender dysphoria, of course, suicide rates are higher. There's going to
Mhm.
be depression. There's going to be comorbid disorders that are almost like caused by the dysphoria.
Mhm.
However, there's also situations like family of origin, or sometimes schizophrenia, autism, things that maybe if you assessed it a little bit thoroughly, if you did therapy with the person and waited, that
So I think what I'm hearing you say is that it's almost like a misdiagnosis when it's done, like sort of rush to judgment by
yes.
a clinician. Yeah, and I think this is interesting because I've had now we're steering a little away from the legal topic of this,
Yes.
but there's definitely a an issue with when is it right for that decision to be made
Mhm.
for an adolescent. We've seen it happen earlier and earlier. I have a friend uh, um, who has a transgender daughter, and at age 12, the parents were very certain. They said her whole life they knew that that
Mhm.
she's a girl, and they went on with hormone treatment. Now they don't live in this country; they live in South America. But the point is that yes, I think there is to some extent some, maybe some misdiagnosis or rushed diagnosis, but in the
Mhm.
legal context, you know, whatever the cause is, I think if you
Mhm.
are suffering from depression, you're suicidal,
Mhm.
and you end up committing a crime, that is something, doesn't matter what the cause was. I mean, of course, we can explain that in sentencing paperwork, but that is something that the judge has to consider as a 3553 factor, because there's a difference between that person committing a crime and somebody who's in perfect mental health. I don't know how many people are in perfect mental health, but someone healthier,
Exactly.
committing a crime, right? It's so that's what's
I have
really
a quick question. I have a quick
Yeah,
question,
go ahead.
Dr. Kaplan. So just so I understand this, gender dysphoria and being transgender, those are two separate things. So you don't, just because somebody is transgender, that does not mean they have gender dysphoria, correct? And if somebody has gender dysphoria, that does not automatically mean they will be transgender. Are they two separate things you're talking about here?
So gender dysphoria, it's 6 criteria, and it's usually it's talking about that dysphoric element. So if somebody transitions and they are like a trans woman and they feel congruent, then they might not meet criteria for gender disorder or gender dysphoric disorder. That's a successful treatment. Just like if somebody had depression and then they were put on therapy with antidepressants and they're no longer, they might have the history and it's still something, that can be noted in the psych record, but they're not experiencing levels of distress. And so that's the argument with like the children is like, if we catch it early, then we're reducing the risk of suicide attempts or harms in the future, or
But I think it's important to note that in Roski's case, Roske did not identify as Sophie Roske until after this incident and while she's been locked up pending trial. So it's understandable that she would have had gender dysphoria, and because there's a lot of talk in this public defender's sentencing papers about how much she suffered over the years. It's that feeling of being trapped and not being able to identify as your biological gender. So I think Safia, the way that I'm reading it is that now that she is now identifying as Sophie and a woman, some of that stuff might be addressed, but at least that the cause is that she was trapped in a man's body for all of these years, and she was suicidal and she was in distress,
and it was sort of contributing to the mental illness, or was
Correct.
exacerbating that mental illness.
Correct.
Okay,
That's how I'm reading.
Okay.
Yeah. So Dr. Kaplan, now you've heard Tyler Robinson's name, I'm sure, in the news. A lot's been said about him. He's, of course, the accused assassin of Charlie Kirk, and his alleged relationship with his roommate, who was transitioning from male to female. Do you think that high-profile case helps or hurts Sophie Roske in her sentencing, or do you think it should have no impact at all?
I do think overall, if we look at transgender individual, I mean, the roommate didn't do anything wrong. So,
Sure.
But there is, according to the parents, that seems that they're saying that played a role, and he was, based off like the casings that he wrote, like there does seem to have been a certain, I say radicalization in quotes, but like an exposure to a different population and like a strong relational component that maybe he felt the need to defend her honor in a sense.
Yeah.
But also that's there's still underlying mental health, because that's not a typical response.
Right, of course, of course.
So
We don't, I mean, I don't think we know enough about, like, to me, I mean, yeah, okay, he's roommates with a transgender woman or someone who's transitioning.
Right.
I could take away from that, he is pro-trans, and therefore maybe Charlie Kirk's views on trans is something that pissed him off or something like
Yes.
that. That's
Yes.
as far as I can conclude. I mean,
Yes.
Sophia, can you take away anything else from this?
I mean, these are all allegations. We don't know. Like
Yeah.
we're hearing that the roommate was transgender. We're hearing there was a relationship. We're hearing. So I guess those are just sort of we're connecting the dots as logically, as reasonably as we can, but we don't know at this point.
Yeah. And also I want to know more about Tyler Robinson and how he was brought up and what he endured in his developmental years, right? Dr. Kaplan? I mean,
Yeah.
what was he suffering from independent of a trans, a lot of straight men are into trans women. I mean, that's, that doesn't make them suffer from those potential mental, right?
And I mean, there's the argument that he could have been radicalized in college, where he was exposed to more liberal ideas, where his family, it's the same kind of thing. And actually what's interesting about him is that he got a scholarship to a university, went there and basically withdrew after a semester.
Yeah.
And had to move to like a community college that was 10 minutes away from home. And that was before meeting the roommate. So there was something there that I think, to me, it seems more autism potentially. But I'm not sure because I haven't, this is not.
No, I just want to remind everyone out there that just because you might be on the spectrum or autistic does not make you criminal. Just because you suffer from any mental illness doesn't mean you are a criminal or will commit a crime. In fact, statistics show that mentally ill individuals are often victimized and victims of crime than they are perpetrators of crime. Same thing goes with trans people. We just happen, like you mentioned before, people are identifying as the opposite sex earlier. So it is to some degree a numbers game. We just have more identified trans people in the community, and therefore there might be a situation where a crime's committed and the person's trans or they transition, but that doesn't make trans people criminals. I just want to send that message out there.
Make sure, Sarah, that, and I think you kind of alluded to this, that even with the Tyler Robinson case, the fact that he had a trans roommate could have nothing to do with it. It was just happened like as if you had like a roommate from another state. It was just a coincidence, and it was something that was 100%.
In fact, there was something
had nothing to do with it.
Yeah, and in fact, there was something where they said in one of these reports I read that his family was at a dinner with his family soon before this assassination, and they were talking about Charlie Kirk coming to the campus, and there was something negative fed to him by his family that sort of set him off as well, and it had nothing to do with trans or trans views. So anyway, politics meets law meets sentencing, all of psychology, all of these things.
Like autistic people with an autism diagnosis, they're usually like not, 99%, they're not violent individuals at all. But sometimes there's an overlap, like in the DSM-5 TR, that's one of the differential diagnoses for gender dysphoria is autism, just because they tend to be more rigid in their thinking, black and white. There's also, like for women, they have higher rates of PCOS, like polycystic ovarian syndrome, and like lower rates of testosterone for men. And so they don't usually, sometimes, and then also the relational component. So there's just pieces of it that sometimes, and they're out there.
When you say differential diagnosis, does that mean that there is a potential other diagnosis with similar sort of symptoms that needs to be further explored?
Yeah, so basically, and schizophrenia is one of them as well. So basically, how the DSM is laid out, it'll say the diagnosis, it'll explain the prevalence rates, and their prevalence rates are low, like base rates of the population for gender dysphoria, but it'll say you need to consider these other diagnoses first and rule them out because there are overlaps or some similar symptoms that can present. And so autism is one of them, schizophrenia is one of them.
I mean,
like transvests, like doing a
yeah,
transvestite,
which
which is
is totally different,
clothing. It's totally different.
than
Exactly.
a trans person. You know what? Before I read
Transvestic.
the Roski's sentencing
Mhm.
paperwork, I thought that the public defender was basically saying that, you know, the fact that Roski is now went through a gender identification issue and is now identifying as a female, that is some sort of mental illness. And I thought that is just awful because that just stigmatizes the trans community and the mentally ill population. But then when
Mhm.
I read it, it all makes sense to me. Again, I'm a defense attorney, and these arguments make sense. I mean, for years and years and years, this individual has suffered feeling trapped in a male body where they identify as a female, and this is a very valid explanation to a federal judge. However, federal judges are elected by the administration. So typically when you have
Mhm.
a Republican in office, you have Republican district court judges that are seated, and the same thing goes with the Democrats. So you know, who knows? I don't know who this judge is, what their ideologies are, and sentencing is completely discretionary for a judge. So long as it's legal, they don't go past a maximum. If there is a maximum, that, and here I think it's life. So there's no limit. And so that they don't do anything that's totally out of whack. They can give a sentence of whatever they feel is justified. And so I don't know how this judge is going to receive depression and distress that's related to dysmorphia, like to a trans
Right.
person. So
Mhm.
it raises a very interesting issue because the man behind that robe is still a human being, and just like jurors come in with biases, judges have their own ideologies. They like certain things, they don't like certain things. So it remains to be seen. But the prosecution's asking for a minimum of 30 years, which is, I think it's the bottom or low end of the sentencing guidelines, and meaning feel free to give her more, And the defense is asking for 8 years, so they're asking for this
Right.
tremendous variance
Right.
below the low end of the guidelines. And when you look at then the mitigating factors that the prosecution is going to argue, the planning, the plotting, just the amount of deliberation that went into this assassination plot, I don't think he's getting less than 30. The question, or she, excuse me, I don't think she's getting less than 30. It's probably, if she is, it's not by much. I definitely see at least 20, 25 years here. On this show, we go back in time to look at some similar issues and other high profile cases. And Safia always does a phenomenal job at sharing some examples. And Dr. Kaplan, I call on you as well to join in the conversation and share your thoughts. But there's been some really wacky defenses that have been claimed over the years. So, Safia, tell us what you have today.
Yeah, a lot of controversial defenses that have been used, and I'm going to go ahead and start with probably what I think is the most controversial. So, there's a defense called the gay/trans panic defense, and
Yeah.
this was used by defendants who cited an uncontrollable, like anger or fear or a loss of self-control when interacting with somebody who they perceive to be a certain sexual orientation or gender identity. And this is mostly in the context of them thinking that person is doing some sort of romantic advance towards them. This was most notably used in the 2002 murder of Gwen Araujo. Gwen Araujo was a 17-year-old who was murdered by 4 men after they found out she was transgender. Now, the defendants used this panic defense at their trial, saying that it was in the heat of the moment and they lost control. It was a mental breakdown, which led them to this horrific attack. That defense did not stick, and all 4 were convicted in her murder. And in fact, California, after that trial, passed a law restricting the use of the panic defense. And at least 20 states have followed suit with some sort of variation of that law. But there's plenty of states that don't, which means that could potentially be used there.
Yeah, I mean that is straight up discrimination, first of all. But is that some sort of mental illness?
Not that I can think of.
Panicking because you think someone is making sexual advances towards you?
No, I mean, women deal with that all the time. I
Right,
mean,
exactly.
I don't think that that's, I think that's more of like just bias and discrimination
Exactly,
along the
And
lines
victim
of
exactly.
race.
blaming.
I mean, that's along the line of racism of like, well, I thought, he was African American, and so I thought he would have a gun because so I panicked and
Awful.
shot him. So
Yeah,
it's like,
yeah. What else do you have, Safia?
Okay, next one is rap music. In 1991, Christopher Martinez argued that he was temporarily hypnotized by rap music by the group Ghetto Boys when he committed a murder. So his attorney said that he was listening to the music moments before this attack, and that kind of prompted him to commit this murder. Luckily, they withdrew that claim, and Martinez ended up pleading guilty.
Well, I'm going to say something just very basic here. If it's a choice that you've exercised, you don't get to use that. If you chose to listen to rap music, I mean, it doesn't matter what the lyrics are, that's not a defense. How crazy. I can't even believe this exists.
The only thing that I can relate that to is, okay, his name's Anders. He was the guy from Norway that like murdered 85 children on an island. This is 2007. This was not his defense. He did not want to use an insanity defense. His attorneys were like, please, please, please use an insanity defense. He claimed that he was radicalized through music like this. It was right wing, like kind of Nazi music. But it wasn't just one exposure, it was repeated. And that was more, it wasn't really, it was more of something that came out in, like if you were doing a pre-sentencing investigation, but not that he was using it as a defense, but that community, the music, repeated listening to it. But then we've got Eminem,
Yeah,
and and I listened to that growing up,
I
and there was
love
some horrible
Eminem.
lyrics, exactly, and I never
Yeah,
did any of those things
yeah,
that
me
he did.
neither.
So, but Anders also, once again, I mean, could be argued that he has trauma, maternal neglect,
Yeah,
like lots of other factors,
yeah.
and maybe on the spectrum. And once again, I don't want to pick on people on the spectrum
I
because
mean, listen, I've had people's song choices and concerts and behavior at concerts. So that stuff has come out as aggravating. I represented a white supremacist gentleman who everything from his tattoos to
Mhm.
the songs in his Apple Music to fights he had incited at very sort of white supremacist concerts and stuff. All that stuff came in at sentencing as an aggravating factor that he's a very
Mhm.
violent person. But I've never seen this kind of defense work that, that you've been influenced by, maybe violent lyrics and therefore you should be given a break. I mean, I trust me, I would use it if I
You'd have to really, I think, do a full assessment about
Yes,
why this person was vulnerable to these
yes,
lyrics, because 99% of the population are going to realize that they're just lyrics and move on with their day. So
correct.
there'd have to be,
You
whether
need a
it's neurologic,
professional.
yes,
Yes. That's
exactly.
why that's why I think this is a really good point to make too, that there's a difference between a forensic psychologist and a treating psychologist. Now, that same person could potentially do both things,
Mhm.
but there are a lot of licensed psychologists who are not forensic psychologists. The
Oh, yeah.
difference is I don't want that person consulting with me or writing a report for me on a client because that person doesn't have the expertise to
Mhm.
look at the charging document and the evidence and then focus on digging into the client's the defendant's background and the songs and the
Right.
those things that because those are things that might very well be relevant to
Right.
like mitigating circumstances and other mental conditions that have a diagnosis, even though on paper you look at it on its face, it's like, what does this have to do with that? You know, a forensic psychologist often connects the dots between these things that come up that we just think like, what does that have to do with anything? You know, and then suddenly you have a diagnosis. And of course, the prosecution always says, oh, you paid this person to write this report. So
They
of
always say
course,
that. I was like, well, I do need to make a living. Like, I'm sorry. Yeah, we all
right,
we all
right.
get paid for our work.
Yeah.
So
All right, Sophia, I think there's one more, right?
Yes, and this one is pretty well known. You guys might remember the affluenza defense.
Mm-hmm.
In 2013, 16-year-old Ethan Couch killed 4 people while drunk driving. And at the time, his attorneys argued that because of his wealthy upbringing, he had what they called affluenza, which is a slang term referring to extreme privilege because of your affluence.
Mm-hmm.
And so they said that because he had this affluenza, it prevented him from understanding the consequences of his actions. And he didn't really grow up understanding right from wrong. That defense stuck. And Couch ended up getting probation instead of prison for these 4 deaths. And of course, a lot of outrage ensued from people saying if this person came from really any other background, the punishment would have been much more harsh.
Well, I think, you know, I think I can tell you that just from my own experience over my career, I have had clients who have probably committed crimes because of affluenza, but it's not a defense, but because growing up, it's not so much the wealth, it's a sense of entitlement. You know, that sense of entitlement that where your parents teach you, you can do no wrong, you are perfect, you know, you grow up with a sense of sort of lawlessness or that you're above the law, you know, that is a problem, but it's not a defense. And then you also have what is the opposite of affluenza? Non-affluenza, because there's also the idea that people, because of where they're brought up in their communities and poverty and despair and gang infested areas and all that, that kind of environment also contributes to criminality too. So no, I don't think that your status comes into play, right?
yeah, and I think, well, is that a diagnosis of psychopathy? Because, you know, the worldview, like the affluenza, I mean, it would depend if the empathy was there and like he was able to understand and kind of put himself in other people's shoes after getting more information and like critical thinking skills. But when I hear that, I'm like, that's a little bit psychopathic.
And you know, one note, he ended up breaking his probation by going to Mexico. And then he came back and ended up facing prison time anyway. So even after getting this,
he still had affluenza. Yeah.
He still didn't think the rules applied to him.
That's more psychopathy or antisocial personality syndrome.
Remember the Varsity Blues case with all the celebrities and a lot of wealthy people who were not celebrities.
College ones, yeah.
Yeah, whose kids had gotten into college by falsifying their, you know, academic backgrounds and their test scores and stuff like that. I mean, if this was a defense, all of those people would be, I think they all got some sort of symbolic sentence because it was kind of a first of its kind type of case. But I think they would have just all those charges would be dismissed. They walk away, but obviously it is not a defense. That's why we talk about it here on Serving Justice, because, you know, there's really interesting conversations around headline cases, past cases that don't quite make it into the zeitgeist and your lateral channels and maybe even some of your streaming shows. And so here we try to take a defense angle because obviously me, and we dig a little deeper and have more meaningful discussions. So I want to thank you, Sophia. Thank you, Dr. Kaplan, for making time for us today. And to our viewers, we really appreciate you streaming and joining and following. And until next week, the defense rests.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe below and download our NewsNation app right now on your phone, and you will get fact-based, unbiased news for all Americans.